Right. Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you can all hear me okay. We had some audiovisual problems there, so I haven't been able to hear anything that the organisers are saying. But hopefully, you can hear me as I make this presentation. My name is Barnaby Page. I'm the editorial director at Tamarind Intelligence, which many of you will know better through our e-cig intelligence brand. So I'm going to talk today about the regulatory impact of disposable vapes. This is going to be pretty much a big picture talk, so I'm not going to be going into detail about the law in particular countries, but really talk about the difference that the disposable explosion over the last few years has made to the regulation of e-cigarettes in general. So I'm just going to very, very quickly, I know this is always the most boring bit of a presentation. I'll just tell you very quickly what the company is for anybody who doesn't know us. We've been running since 2014. We are an independent provider of analysis and information related to the industries we cover. We're not funded by the tobacco industry. In fact, we have many major public health organizations and regulators among our clients. And we have three brands: e-cig intelligence, which covers e-cigarettes and vapes. Same thing, but different terms used for the same thing. But I think this is an especially vivid one, and it shows the growth of disposables in the United States over the last 5 years as a percent of all e-cigarette users, all adult users. You can see there that it's about 45%, a little under half. But of course, what is most dramatically interesting here is the way that it was almost nothing in 2019. Even 2020, it was only 10%. And then it just absolutely exploded, absolutely mushroomed since then. And we see that happening in many, many major markets. So in the US, about 45% of adult vapers are using disposables. In the UK, 35%. In many, many countries, between 10 and 30%. In Brazil, more than 50%. Now, some people may say, wait a minute, that's weird because aren't e-cigarettes banned in Brazil? And you'd be quite right. But that shows a very important aspect of the disposable market, which is quite a lot of it is technically illicit. In Brazil, all e-cigs are technically illicit. And so it's made great inroads there, not, I would suggest, to the benefit of the e-cigarette sector, or not to the benefit of public health, perhaps, even though it may, of course, be appealing to individual consumers. It's important to the industry as well. Now, this is not a talk about the industry today, but just to give you a picture here of the way disposables are present in US vape stores. These are figures from last year. You can see again the orange parts of the bar chart here show the percentage of revenue per store that comes from disposables. In 2019, it didn't even register. In 2020, it was just creeping into appearance at 11%. By 2023, it was a full third of revenue was coming from disposables. So as with the user numbers, they are not completely dominating the market the way that the media might sometimes have us believe, but they are certainly taking a very large share of the market and have been taking it very quickly indeed. They're also important to some individual users as a way into vaping. This is a slightly complex chart, but if you look at the bottom half of it, we have the United States on the left and the UK on the right. And looking at those who were nicotine naive before they started vaping, in other words, people who hadn't smoked or used some other form of tobacco or nicotine before, you see that a large number of them, particularly among the youngest age group, came in via disposables. Again, not totally dominant. People are coming in via other closed systems or open systems as well. But the younger users particularly, disposables were a major, major way of getting them into vaping. I should also add that this survey is about 2 years old. So that data is almost certainly a significantly larger number now. And of course, you will see the members of that younger cohort in turn becoming members of the older cohorts. Certainly some of those 21 to 24-year-olds will now be in the 25 to 34 group, even if they obviously haven't made the 35 plus yet. Significantly related to this, then, of course, is the question of what would disposable users do if disposables were no longer available. Now we have some data here from the US, from our survey last year, where 32%, so a third effectively of disposable users, said they were not interested in any other products. Quite a lot interested in refillable pods or pods in general, and then very few really interested in open systems and various minor bits of interest in other things. Now, this, of course, comes from a situation where disposables were not banned, so they were still available. So it was easy for people to say, well, I'm not really interested in anything else. In reality, if disposables did disappear completely from the market, and I hasten to add, that a ban does not necessarily mean disappearance from the market in reality. In reality, of course, some of those people would go for refillable pods or even open systems, or what have you. But there is clearly some kind of risk that some users would be unwilling to move to other vape products and might return to smoking or go to smoking. There's also, of course, the interesting possibility these days that they might go to pouch products as well. And I'll say a little bit more about pouch later on, because I think it has some things in common with disposables. It is worth noting, having said all this, that the disposable market is not necessarily going to be here forever anyway. Leave aside whatever may happen in terms of regulation, we can certainly see in Europe, for example, as you can see on these three graphs, that pre-filled pods are making quite significant inroads. Perhaps see that most noticeably in France, the graph on the right, where the disposables numbers seem to actually be dropping down as pods increase. Disposables are still well ahead, particularly in the UK, but pods are on the rise. So we shouldn't necessarily assume in any case that the disposables will always be around exactly as we know them. And of course, as I'll say in a few minutes, regulation will have something to do with that as well. I want to mention flavors. I know flavors have been discussed quite a bit already at this conference, not least by Konstantinos yesterday. But I think that's worth reiterating, because the issue of disposables is so tightly tied in with the issue of flavors. And we can see here, this looks at flavor categories of disposables in the United States. So the picture is broadly speaking similar in most markets, and we can see that fruit flavors are absolutely dominant there. Fruit being the blue that occupies by far the largest part of each bar. Finally, talking about products themselves, I'd just like to remind us that disposables have not stood still by any means. And we tend to think of those sort of almost cigar-like disposables that are just very simple sticks. In fact, they've moved far, far beyond that. LED screens, as many people will know, are a big feature now. Increasing amounts of interactivity, so showing you the amount of remaining e-liquid or the amount of time you've been vaping, etc., etc. There have been some moves to make products more environmentally responsible. The products themselves are improving from the vapor point of view. And then we have something that I'll mention again at the end of the presentation, what I call non-disposable disposables, which are refillable and rechargeable disposables. So essentially they offer some of the advantages from the consumer's point of view of a disposable e-cigarette, but they can in fact also be refilled and recharged. And these, of course, are going to be very significant products in terms of regulation, because if whatever regulatory measures are taken focus on non-rechargeability and non-refillability, then the holy grail, if you like, certainly for the e-cigarette industry and perhaps for some users, is something that has all these other disposable features, but can be refilled and can be recharged. So that was talking about the market generally. I'd now like to talk about regulation. I'm aware that we're about halfway through the presentation time already, because we started a bit late. This is the big picture as we interpret it. The regulation of reduced risk nicotine products in general. Of course, primarily that does mean e-cigarettes, so it also includes heated tobacco and pouch and a few other product types like herbal heated sticks. Red is, from a harm reduction point of view on this map, red is bad. The brownish khaki color is moderate and the green is positive. The obvious takeaway is that the world is very red, and really only a few corners of Europe and New Zealand are green. I think it's difficult to generalize, but we have seen that picture get worse, get redder, if you like, over the last few years. Sentiment toward harm reduction seems to have got worse or more critical in most countries rather than more positive. Though there have been exceptions, for example, increased liberalization in the Middle East. But generally, the picture is toward tighter control rather than looser control. And there are some significant legal risks that we've sort of outlined on the right-hand side of this chart here for e-cigarettes in general. There's the possibility of outright bans that that have happened in some countries, and indeed are being perpetuated in some countries. Mexico, for example, recently. There's simply stricter regulation and often equalization with combustible cigarettes. There are environmental restrictions, which I'll mention again briefly in a minute. To be fair, these are not generally targeted directly at e-cigarettes, they're generally targeted at consumer products or products in general. But they impact e-cigarettes. And then there are bans on disposables specifically. So the policy concerns about disposables, the biggest one undoubtedly is youth usage. Rightly or wrongly, it is perceived that our young people are, vaping away since disposables arrived. And there is certainly, to some extent, that is true. And the concerns there are, of course, largely the so-called gateway into tobacco smoking. Whether it actually exists or not, I would argue, is irrelevant. The important point is that governments and policymakers believe it exists. A secondary concern, but it's not really one you hear about much at a political policy level, is the alleged direct effects of nicotine on young people's bodies. So youth usage is the really big one. Environmental impact, however, has also become an issue with disposables. Now, it's quite easy to believe that people were looking for another problem to find with disposable e-cigarettes, if you like, and environmental impact was what they found. But nevertheless, it is a genuine issue and one that ought to be addressed. And then there's also illicit product, of course, as well. So just moving on quickly, I'll talk briefly about the regulatory responses, or the possible regulatory responses to the rise of disposables. Now, the most drastic one, of course, that the government can make is to completely ban disposables as such, to define the disposable category, typically as something that can be not refilled or not recharged, and then say, well, okay, these are not allowed. We'll see shortly who is actually looking at bans. Then there are flavor bans, which are not directly, strictly speaking, targeted at disposables, but in effect, they ban the disposable market. Because as we've seen, very, very few disposable users want to use tobacco flavor. They overwhelmingly want fruit-type flavors. And so a flavor ban which eliminates those effectively takes disposables out of the market, or at least out of the legitimate legal market. These flavor bans, of course, are largely introduced in the belief that it's flavors that primarily appeal to young people. That's a very debatable point, to put it mildly. But again, the perception is equally as important, if not more, than reality. Related to that, we may have restrictions on packaging and marketing. So not on the flavors necessarily themselves as such, but on the way those flavors are marketed. An example of that would be, the use of very, very fancy product descriptions, flavor descriptions. We can have greater enforcement on retailing and on importers. We've seen quite a bit of this in the United States recently. A number of crackdowns on imports of disposable product from China. At the retail end, this can also include restrictions on retail display, on how things can be displayed in the store. And finally, we can have mandatory recycling programs. I think most people, including many in the industry, would agree that these are actually a positive, though nevertheless they clearly impose some kind of burden on the industry and on retailers and manufacturers. And of course, as I say, a lot of this environmental regulation, it's not specifically targeted at e-cigarettes, but nevertheless, it does affect them. And in a sense, disposables have, but because they're disposable, have made themselves vulnerable to that. So I mentioned bans. There's a lot of talk about disposable bans. Mostly, to be fair, it is still talk at the moment, but I think, it's highly, highly likely that an increasing number will be seen. And these are some of them in fairly major markets like the United Kingdom and France. There's the possibility of a pan-EU disposable ban in the next Tobacco Products Directive. We simply don't know, but it's a possibility that has to be borne in mind. It must be on the table. And of course, there are also local jurisdictions. In Germany, for example, it was, I believe, Bavaria that initiated the move toward banning disposables. In the United States, there have been some moves at state level. New York, I think, for example, major state has a bill in progress at the moment. Moving beyond that, though, I'd like to just comment as well on the reputational impact that disposables have had. And I think this is significant because when we talk about the regulation of disposables, we sometimes run the risk of just focusing narrowly on how those particular products can be regulated. But actually, they have a broader impact on the way that novel nicotine products, reduced risk products in general, are perceived, and therefore how the law is framed for them. A key point, of course, is they have refocused attention, if attention ever went away, to the issue of underage use rather than smoking cessation. And I'm sure many, many people listening today, this is the constant to and fro between, if you like, the pro-THR and anti-THR people. One side wants to emphasize smoking cessation, the other wants to emphasize underage use. We have the environment waste issue. It's a new concern. It's a legitimate concern, but nevertheless, it's created a bit of a perfect storm along with the youth issue. And in general, we have the existence of an illicit market, products that in whatever way are not compliant with the law. And that undermines the reputation of the legitimate market as well. Indeed, you could argue it even undermines the reputation of people arguing in favor of THR. So just to conclude, I believe that 2024 into early 2025 really is a turning point in terms of disposables. Where regulatory response is concerned, I think the key question is not actually whether disposables are regulated, because it's clear they will be. I think the question is how far if you like, the fallout, the collateral damage goes beyond the disposables themselves. In terms of the industry response, we are already seeing what I call the non-disposable disposable. I think we'll very likely see an increasing number of those. We have to then ask, of course, will regulation be reframed to take those in? That will again depend, I think, very much on whether there's a perception of high underage use. Consumer response, we have to see what happens. Consumers operate in unpredictable ways. What will happen to those consumers who have been using disposables if disposables disappear from the market? The answer is, of course, a lot of them will go to illicit product, but those who don't, what will they choose? And finally, I will leave you with the thought, could pouches be next? Nicotine pouches come onto the scene even more recently than disposable. It's really only in the last year or so that it's been sort of something you see mentioned in the mainstream media. But already there are the early signs of some concern over that. And I don't think it's inconceivable that by, say, 2025, 2026, we might have a new panic about youth use of nicotine pouches. I hope not, but I think that's a possibility to bear in mind. So that's, thank you from me. If you want to get hold of me, there's my email address. There are the URLs for the two services that might be of interest, e-cig intelligence and tobacco intelligence.